Okay, in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through some of the aspects of the relational database model that I want you to concentrate on in Chapter 3. We're going to walk through an example, a very simple example, and then what we're going to do is we're going to implement that in SQL Server. And I don't want you to get bogged down in the SQL Server. We're not quite to that stage in the class, but it's going to be your first look at how the software works with the things you're trying to implement, but it also allows us to use some of the tools that are built in. So in this chapter, or in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to create a relational database for, it's the very basic information needed for a realtor's database. And so we're going to have a table that has realtors in it. That would be one of the entities we would probably define. Those realtors are going to have customers who are selling things. And then of course we're going to have a table that contains the stuff that they're selling. Now a realtor database would be a lot more complicated than this, but again, it's just to show you some of the main concepts that are presented in this chapter. So we're looking at just a Word document that I typed up to kind of outline what we're doing. In Chapter 4, we'll get into ERD diagrams that will solidify this process a whole lot more and allow us to design models that will help us with our database design. But for now, I have the 3 tables set out with some of the attributes that we would add. I limited these for the example as well because you're going to have to watch me type these into the database, and the last thing you want to do is spend your days watching me type stuff. So I've narrowed it down to some of the things that you would find in there, but of course there would probably be a whole lot more. So we have an agent table. And when we create this table, we're going to have to determine what would work well to uniquely identify each agent. So we're going to have to choose a primary key, and we'll talk about what that will be once we get in there. We're going to record the first name, last name, cell phone, and hire date of the agent. Again, there would be a lot more that we would add, but this gives us a variety of data types that we can cover while we're in SQL Server. Then we're going to have our customer table. Again, we're going to need to identify what's going to work well for this. We can't use our first name and last name because there could be tons of people named John Smith selling their houses, just like we could have tons of agents named John Smith. So we'll have to work to find a primary key that is going to uniquely identify this customer. We'll take their first name, their last name, their cell phone. Of course, we would get a whole lot more information about them too. And then finally, we're going to look at the property that the customers are going to be selling. We'll need an ID. Now in this one, there might be a good ID that you think the address, so 123 Main Street, but again, 123 Main Street by itself might not work, particularly for a realtor who's covering multiple areas. Those places all might have a Main Street with a 123 address on it. We could combine those with address city or address zip, and that would probably give us a unique composite key. But we'll talk about what I would probably do in this situation when we get into the database itself. But in addition to address information, we're going to record the number of bathrooms, the number of bedrooms, the square footage, the price, and the date that the house is going to be available on the market. Because sometimes people list their house with the realtor, and while they're getting everything ready, you know, they're not ready to start showing it until a certain day. So we'll have a separate list date for that. So the things we need to talk about in this section, and we're going to talk about what data type should we select for each of our fields. This is important, and a lot of times it's going to be tied to your business rules, and I'll talk through some of those as we go along. Before we do the database itself though, I want to talk about the relationships that exist. These are going to be determined somewhat by the business relationship, but sometimes it's just determined by the way the world works. So in our case, we're going to say that a customer only has one agent. So one person in this table will be tied to many people in this table, but there's only one corresponding agent for this. So we have a classic one-to-many relationship. An agent has many customers, but many customers have one agent. All right. So a customer can have many properties, and properties as a whole will have many owners. And so when we look at the relationship between our customer table and our property table, we start to see a problem. We have a many-to-many relationship, and that's one thing that a relational database model does not handle well. What you have to do when you encounter a many-to-many relationship is what you're going to do is you're going to put at least one more table in between those, bridging those two entities. And so what we'll probably end up doing is adding a table to resolve this many-to-many relationship. So I'm not going to include it here on our initial notes. What I'll do is I'll introduce that concept when we're actually in the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch on over to SQL Server, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new database. Actually, I'm not even going to do it this way. I'm going to just come here and do new database. I need to give it a name, so I have a realtor database. This is stuff that it sets up for its own internal working. We're going to go ahead and add the tables individually. So we go ahead and click OK. We let that chug away, and now we have a realtor database with all of these, all this functionality available to us from SQL Server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the table tag. Now there are some built-in things that it adds, but we're just going to right click and we're going to add a new table. And in SQL Server what we do is we design the table first. We'll design the rows and we'll set the we'll set the attributes, we'll set the characteristics of the attribute, and then we'll save the table and establish relationships. So let's go ahead and talk about a primary key for the agent. That's the first thing we're going to deal with. The only thing that truly identifies us without getting into very complex keys, and particularly here in the United States, is our social security number. And a lot of times, if you have access to that, a lot of times that's what's going to be used in a database because it's the closest thing we have to a real unique identifier of a person in our society. If you break it down to the state level, you might think about driver's license number combined with the state that issues it. You start to get into problems then because what happens if somebody doesn't drive, they don't have a driver's license, how do you identify them in the database? Now back to social security number, even though it's very tempting a lot of times because of the sensitive nature of that, you don't have access to it. For example, in the Tarleton database, I actually don't have access to your social security number. We have it somewhere, I'm sure, but I as a faculty member don't have access to it because it's so sensitive. And so what Tarleton does instead is they assign you a arbitrary student ID number. And what's happening behind the scenes is when somebody enrolls, they put a number in. When the next person enrolls, they increase that number by 1. The next person enrolls, they increase that number. So they increment or count the students. So we're going to do a similar thing here, assuming in our agent database we don't have access to their social security number. So we're going to go ahead and make up a column name for our agent. Now we also have to choose a data type, and this is kind of glossed over in chapter 3, but it is very important. And if you look on page 71 of chapter 3, it talks about the 4 basic data types that are available. And this is a very, very basic approach. Most of the modern relational database management systems have very refined different versions of these, and we'll look at some of these, but you need to become familiar with them in the database you're using. So there are numeric ones. A lot of times databases will break them down into, does the number have a decimal on it, or does the number not have a decimal on it? Is it integer or decimal? Characters, there are a lot of different versions and lengths of character data types. Date, exactly what it says, but a lot of times there are all variations of that, and I'll show you that in SQL Server as well. And then logical is also called a Boolean. You probably found this in your programming, but it's a yes, no, or a true, false value. So it's kind of like, does this house have a lien on it or something like that? You would have a yes, no value there. But if we look at the data types here in SQL, you can see that those are a lot more complicated. if we want to look at the different numbers, we have a big int, we have decimal, we have numeric, we have money variables, we have all different kinds of numbers. And again, when you're working with the program, you need to be familiar with that, because when you're choosing a data type, you need to ask yourself a couple of things. First of all, what are all the different types of data that might find its way into this field? You also need to ask yourself, what's going to be done with this field? And then once you kind of have narrowed it down to probably which data type you're going to have, you need to start to ask yourself how much data is going to show up in one field. So for example, if you had a database value of state and you knew you were only going to store the 2-digit state code, you wouldn't want to have a character field that accommodates 50 characters. It's a waste of space because the database will have to set aside that base in char, not in varchar. And we'll talk about the difference of that later. So you need to be concerned about how much space you're setting aside. How long should a first name field be? How long should, a text field be where people are going to enter their comments? Those things a lot of times will be determined by efficiency decisions, but also business decisions. Okay. Another thing to think about when you're choosing between a numeric and a data or a character data type is ask yourself, is there going to be math done with that? And the reason I say that is a lot of times we have data that is numerical in appearance, but it really has no numerical value to us. And Social Security is a perfect example. I would never add my Social Security number to your Social Security number to get any good data. Zip code's the same. But salaries, we might need to do math with that. And so as a result, you would choose different data types for that. So for this, what we're going to do though is we're going to create a specific unique identifier data type that is available in SQL, because that is eventually going to be our primary key. So then we're going to add the agent's first name, and we're going to use an nvarchar. And again, this is just one of those that is built into SQL Server, and we will come back and talk about these later on in the semester. And I can't stop that beeping noise. Every time I'm going through these, it's auto-saving behind the scenes, and that's why it is beeping at me. So again, we're going to go ahead and add the agent cell phone number. And again, I'm going to go ahead and just keep this as a varchar because we're not going to be adding anybody's cell phone number to another. It's really just for display purposes, and plus that allows us to put parentheses and dashes as we see fit. So we have all of our, let's flip back to our Word document right here. We didn't have hire date. I forgot hire date. So let's go back to hire date. And the reason I added that is I want to show you that, first of all, that I can't type. And then also I want to show you the data types for dates. And so we have different ones here. We have just date, which would set just the date. I can add the time to that, and then I can have some different variations on that. So I'm just going to say this for date. I don't need to know that they started at 8 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so that is our agent table. We have everything we need from our initial specifications. And so I'm going to go ahead and just save that. I'm going to name this agent. And we're going to do the same thing for, now if it doesn't show up here, again, this is just a SQL Server tip. If it doesn't show up here, just hit the refresh and it's going to then eventually show up here. So don't freak out if it doesn't, it saved it. All right, I'm going to do a new table. We'll go through these real quickly. I'm going to have the customer. And again, I probably have access as a realty company to the customer's social security number because of tax purposes and everything I'm going to need to actually do the mortgage. But again, that's sensitive information and you might not want to expose that to everybody in the company. So as a result, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and assign each customer a unique ID and allow them to be referred to in the database by that. And so I'm going to add the customer's first name, and I'm going to add the customer's last name, and sticking with that variable character field, we'll have the customer's, what did I have? Their cell phone, and we'll have that stay the same. And what else did we need for the customer? We go back here and that's all we have. Okay, so we're going to work on the property table next. I'll save this. I'll name this customer. And when I go over and refresh my table view, I now have an agent and a customer table. So I'm going to go ahead and add the last table real quick. It's not really the last table, but initially we think it's going to be the last table. So let's go ahead and do new table. Now, again, let's talk about what uniquely identifies this property. If I were to take the address and a zip code, that would probably do it. To be sure, I could use the address, the city, the state, and the zip code to truly uniquely identify something. For tax purposes, I guarantee you they don't have duplication in that, or they shouldn't. But then what we're doing is we're creating what's called a composite key. It's a primary key that is made up of multiple attributes, and there are pros and cons, and a lot of times this is a design decision that you will make either based on your preferences or on the way your company has decided to implement databases. And so what you'll see, instead of having the computer have to process 4 fields at once for a primary key, or think about having to search for something like that, you'd have to enter all 4 keys, or when you're trying to uniquely find that record, you would have to enter all 4. So again, if there's not a good primary key that's easy to work with, a lot of times you'll have the database assign one for you. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to have the prop address. We're going to have the property state, city. I hate that, but I really can't. I probably could turn it off if I looked around. Property state. And again, if we were really doing this, I would spend a lot more time choosing my data types and setting the limits of those. But again, when we actually get to using SQL Server, I'll come back and show you some of those things. So prop zip is also one of those number fields that oops, I missed it somehow. That we're never going to do math with. All right, so after our address, let's have the number of bathrooms. Now this is going to be a numerical. I might need it for comparison's sakes. I might need it for math at some point. So I'm going to choose a different data type. I'm going to choose one of the numeric values, and I'm going to have not an int, I'm going to have a decimal. Because in houses, you see that the people have half baths. So you see 3.5 baths in a listing. Now in my decimal data type right here, easiest way to think about this is how many decimal points or how many numbers there are in the whole number. So how big can the number get? And then the number on the right is how many decimal points will be accommodated. Well, we're not going to have a 3.25 bath or something like that. So we only need 1 decimal point. And unless we're selling just gymongous mansions or commercial properties, maybe. Again, this would be a business rule, but realistically, I think we could probably say the most we're going to sell is 2 digits above the decimal point and 1 digit after. So we're going to have a 3.1 decimal. So that means that we could have 10.5 baths, but we couldn't have 300.5 baths. Okay. So bedrooms, though, those are pretty much straightforward. You don't have half bedrooms, and so that's going to be, we're going to go ahead and set that one as an integer because we don't want any decimal types on that. Square footage, again, is usually going to be an integer. Now, this is a perfect example of, well, first of all, the fact that I can't type. This is a perfect example of a numeric field. We might have a derived field that we get a calculation of the price of the house divided by the square foot to get the price of the house per square foot, which is something that you see fairly regularly in a listing. We probably wouldn't want to store that value, but we need both of those to be in a numeric format so that we can actually do that calculation. So we're going to add the price. Again, a numeric, it would probably be a decimal, but generally speaking, you don't add 50 cents to the price of a house, but you could do that. But there are also money formats built into SQL, so I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And then finally, we're going to add the list date. And from this one, I'm actually going to choose date time instead of date because it might be available on a certain date after a certain time. And so I'm going to go ahead and expand that just in case we need that extra set of information. Because if I don't plan ahead, inevitably what happens is somebody says, ooh, you know, it's going to be available, but it's not going to be available until noon. And now my database is not able to accommodate that. Or I have to add another field for time, which is a perfectly acceptable approach as well. But the data type in SQL Server handles that for you. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. We're going to name this property. And now we're going to look at our database diagram. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new database diagram. And what this does is it allows us to look at the tables and the relationships and start thinking about the keys and things like that in our table. So I'm going to go ahead and add all three of my tables. This really is why I'm using SQL Server to do this, because it gives us a visual representation of how these things are going to be related. So we start to, first of all, let's set our primary keys. And our primary keys are those IDs that we set up to uniquely identify what tells us what an entity or a unique entity is in the table. So I'm going to right click this and I'm going to set agent ID as my primary key, customer ID is going to be my primary key, and property is going to be my primary key. So we get to the next step of our phase. So we've set up our tables, we've chosen the data types, we've identified the primary key issues we have, and now we have to start working on these relationships. So going back to SQL Server, what our goal here is to tell the database how all of these tables are related. Now, all of the tables in your database are not necessarily related directly to a table. So for example, an agent is not going to be directly related to a property, but the agent is going to be related to a customer who in turn will be related to a property. And that's where relational database comes in. That's where the magic exists. But we have that many-to-many problem. We can't keep saying this customer ID goes with this property ID, and this customer ID goes with that property ID, and this customer ID goes with that. What happens is you can see that your primary key would then no longer be unique. Okay? So we can resolve this in a couple of ways. And it really depends on if we allow properties to have multiple owners or not. If we didn't have multiple owners, then we could probably get away with a one-to-many by adding a field in this table that reflected the customer ID. But we're going to complicate it a little bit just so we have to show a join between that. Okay? So, looking at this, with the fields we've identified, we see that there's no way to join any of these tables. There's nothing in the agent table that matches up with the customer table. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at this And we're going to say if there's one agent to many customers, we need to talk about where that relationship is linked between these tables. And this just takes practice. But realistically, what you're going to do is you're going to add a field to the customer table that allows you to look up the agent name from this table. So I'm going to go back to my tables over here. I'm going to go back to, or actually they're already still open up here. I'm going to go back to my customer table, and I'm going to add a new field named Agent ID. And what that does is it sets up a foreign key that will allow me to link back to that primary key. So I'm going to save that. I don't know what's happening there. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and have to drop that. And it's not going to let me. Okay, so let me go ahead and just get my diagram here. Get rid of my diagram. Nope, I want to say no to that. Okay, so let me see if it'll let me. Oh, my customer table went away somewhere. Alright, so let me go ahead and open this in the design view. Let's see if it'll let me do it now. Okay, so saved. I'm not sure, we had a little technical glitch there. So I have my customers. So now what this is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to link my agent into my customer. One customer has one agent, and that's a one-to-one relationship in this table. So before we go back to the diagram, let's talk about the problem with many customers having many properties and many properties having many customers. What you do a lot of times in that instance is you put in a bridge table and you create an intermediary table that has a one-to-many relationship with one table on one side and a one-to-many relationship with the table on the other side. So what we'll do is we will create a new table. I'm not sure where my property table went. I guess I didn't save it. Okay, something's going on. Something's going on and I don't know what it is. Okay, let me see if I can get out of this without having to redo all of this. Tables, there everything is. I'm just having some memory problems, it looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new table to show you that link. And again, linking tables, you can use a composite key of both entities. So in the example in your textbook, they have course to class. You can use that as its own composite key, or you can create another unique ID. And that's the approach I usually take. You can also store other information here. In this join table, your book and the example shows the grade received in that. But we're not going to have any additional information. We just need the table that allows us to make those relationships. So I'm going to go ahead and set up the customer to property ID, and this is just going to uniquely identify each row in this table that is recording one of those relationships. So we're going to have the customer ID here, and whoops, I put an extra R on there. Well, and then we're also going to have the property ID that it is tied to. Let me try this again. And that's all we need in this table. Like I said, if there was something else we needed to store about this particular customer property pairing, we could store it right here. But in this database, we don't really need to do that. I'm going to go ahead and save this database. We're going to name this customer to property. And then we're going to go back to, we're going to close that down so I can get out of these saving problems I'm having. And we're going to go back and do our new database diagram. We're going to add all 4 of these. And since we were unable to save that, we do have to, let me grab this table that got put over there because I have rearrange everything just so we can see it all in one place. So this right here is the basic building block of a relational database. We have our tables, we have our primary keys on all of our tables, and now what we can do is we can tell the database that this customer ID joins to this customer ID. It's going to come up and ask you some things about the relationship, which we'll go over later, but for now we're going to say yes. We can say this agent ID here is the same as this agent ID and establish that relationship. So notice we have a one-to-many, we have a one-to-many. We can say this property is now established to, well, maybe we can, to this property. I'm getting the line, but it's back there. It'll set up those relationships for us. So now we have a one-to-many to this join table, we have a one-to-many to this join table, and we have a one-to-many to this table. So the way this works in the real world is if I have a query that says, find all of the properties that agent Leah Schultz has listed right now, what it would do is it would come up and it would say, okay, Leah has these customers, and of those customers they have these properties, or they show up in this table in conjunction with a property ID, so go look up the information about that property ID and add that to the list of properties that Leah has. Now this is a very simplistic thing. If you look at the if you look at some of the diagrams that they start showing you in chapter 3, talking about student databases and faculty and classes and courses and semesters and departments and advisors, all of those things are entities in themselves, and so they're going to have tables that have to have these relationships presented. So this was just a very quick look at the relational database model. Don't get bogged down in the SQL Server part of it. We'll come back to that around mid-semester when you start working on your final semester projects. But for now, just understand that we have these tables that are representing different entities. Inside those tables, we have these attributes, and with this primary key to foreign key relationship is how we tell the database to link this information together. It allows us to get from this agent all the way out to this property. Okay, so what we'll look at in the next chapter is we're going to actually have a couple of videos on how to use some software to allow us to do some diagramming. But what we're going to do is we're going to conceptualize all of this into a diagram that allows us to, again, refine those relationships before we get into building our databases.